Black Death was one of the worst pandemics in all of human history, wiping out about half of Europe's population. Welcome to our video about life after the Black Death. Okay, so first we will be talking about the environmental impact of the plague. So more than half of the farmland formerly under cultivation just became wasteland or pasture. So this allowed a lot of animals to thrive in these areas and really engage and go back into the world. Most abandoned fields returned to woodlands, which heavily increased the forested areas in Europe for the first time in centuries. A lot of the nutrients in the soil was replenished because many of the farmers before the Black Death would overwork the soil, so it became really unhealthy and bad for the crops. But during this time, a lot of the farmers died, so the soil had time to replenish its nutrients. A lot of farmers during this time also noticed a declining demand for grain, and so they began to diversify their crops as well as their livestock and herds. Yersinia pestis also became dormant during this time, but a sudden change in the temperature could potentially revive it. For the second slide, we will be talking about the social impact of the plague. So, life after the Black Death, there was a relative abundance of food, meaning the price of grain began to decrease, and that made bread the staple of the medieval diet because it was so affordable. The scarcity of peasant laborers also gave the peasants higher wages because there wasn't as many workers. There was also lower food prices because there was less demand for food, because there was less people, of course, because of the Black Death. So ordinary people could afford a better and more balanced diet, which led to improved health, fertility rates, and birth rates. So the population began to skyrocket at this time, actually, because of the high fertility rates and birth rates. Also, small farmers during this time could increase the diversity and size of their holdings, whereas large landholders began to respond to the worker shortage of forcing unpaid labor against some peasants. This resulted in some areas of Eastern Europe that were formerly free peasant states, and it turned them into serfdom states once again. But France and Low Countries and England, they began to have more freedoms, and in fact, serfdom completely disappeared in England during this time. There was also increased economic opportunity, which led to increased geographic mobility. This geographic mobility and social mobility were intertwined during this period. A lot of urban areas were not equally affected, so some recovered, but a lot of urban areas had most of the people killed. Some places like Paris and London had a lot of immigrants, but the Black Death was heavy in those places. Due to a lot of immigrants from the countryside, the deaths from the Black Death and the immigrants from the countryside, those two kind of canceled out, so the population basically stayed the same. There was a lot of internal violence in some urban areas because Christians blamed the Black Death on the Jews, which wasn't very good for these areas, and it just ended up having more people killed than there was in the Black Death. Fueling this growth was the increasing specialization of the late medieval economy. On the whole, Europeans that survived profited from the plague. On the third slide, we will be talking about popular revolts and rebellions. A popular revolt during this time was the Jacquerie Rebellion, which was in northern France, and it was when the peasants had violent uprisings against their lords. Another violent revolt was the English Peasants' Revolt in June 1381. This was when thousands of peasants marched in London, and they mainly focused on the royal government, and they planned to capture and kill the Archbishop of Canterbury, and their plan ended up succeeding, and they killed him. During this time, they met with King Richard II, who was 14 at this time, to settle their disputes. The peasants demanded an end to serfdom and taxation, and they called for the redistribution of property. This was so important for them because the redistribution of property made it so that the peasants had the opportunity to gain property, because during this time the lords had basically all the property during this time. There's also heavy taxation on them, so their high wages didn't help them as much as they would. Serfdom obviously wasn't a good thing in England, and they ended up getting rid of it, which is very good. Some common features of the revolts were there was a growing prosperity and self-confidence in village communities and urban laborers who heavily took advantage of the changed circumstances and made a profit, which was very good for them.
Aristocracy after the plague. Most noble families typically got their money from land holdings, but after the plague, some tried to increase their money by investing in trading ventures. Commerce became a route to higher status, but once a merchant became an aristocrat, he could not go back to his non-aristocratic ways. The aristocrats had to live a specific way. They must have been from aristocratic ancestors. They also were supposed to live the specific lifestyle that the other aristocrats lived. This meant they had to own land, they must have had political influence, they must have had courtly manners, and a display of wealth. All of these led to a sign of honor and noble status. This showed what the aristocrats thought about themselves and how much higher they were in the social classes. They also took elaborate measures to show that they were better than others. They spent a lot of money and put an emphasis on their refined taste. They also followed chivalric orders. Men were honored if they demonstrated the ideal virtues of knighthood. That meant that if you lived up to your chivalric duties, you would be exalted. They were also exalted as a class of higher nobility and of greater power. This, in turn, strengthened the bonds between powerful families and their sovereign lords. These alliances would make Europe more grand and more powerful. Literature in the medieval era focused on intense observations of the real world. Books were read by more people than ever before, giving them more publicity. They started to change views on several topics, including social, political, and religious thoughts. Vernacular became a better way of expressing literary ideas, and they came from regional identities. One of the major authors at this time was Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived in the 1300s in Italy. He wrote about human folly and their vices. Another one of the great writers of this age was Geoffrey Chaucer, who also lived in the 1300s. He wrote the Canterbury Tales, which is considered one of the greatest Middle English writings of all time. Another great writer was Christine de Pizan, who lived also in the 1300s. She is known for writing the Book of the City of Ladies, which gave a defense for the character and history of women. She also wrote pamphlets against misogyny, advocating for women. Philosophy after the plague was a little different. Its goal was to capture real experiences and convey real emotions. Paintings were greatly valued at this time. There was a new technique introduced to the art world. People started painting in oils. This movement was started in Flanders and immediately became a revolutionary artistic idea. This is because the paint did not dry as quickly as other water-based pigments did. A painter can now move more slowly and carefully, taking time on the more complex aspects of the work. These paintings began to have more of a profound spiritual message. Other arts, like the dramatic arts, began to unite communities with some of their place. Not all were religious, although that was a major part of society at the time. Some honored nobles, some gave a retelling of the Black Death, and others were just about things in society. This has been our recap of the medieval life after the Black Death. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day.